Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And what an honor and a gift to be in this space together. My name is Rabbi Jenna Shah. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm the Associate Director of Israel Campaigns and Education here at Trua. Today, we're continuing a conversation that is seeming to become a part of a series. It's co-presented by Trua and our Emor Institute. Trua is a human rights organization representing more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors in North America, and is where most of our response to the war is housed, including our response to events as they occur, organizing and supporting clergy, and being a public moral voice. The part of this webinar that feels more like a more is how we're stepping back from the news cycle and its urgency of the headlines to consider the situation through the lens of Jewish questions, Jewish morals, and larger questions around ethics. Emor is here to ask big questions and to bring as many people together into the conversation, to think about what is our role and what is the role of Jewish tradition and helping us understand morality. Before we jump in, I want to say a little bit about how this webinar and how much of our response is coming to be. This came out of a conversation for those of us who were grappling with what it means to shape Trua's role around this war. And we realized that so much of what is happening is like a page of Talmud. It's full of moral questions and uncertain answers. So we thought that our role is to shape and bring these Jewish questions into life. And that's what we're doing here. So before I introduce our speaker today, I want to say that this webinar is being recorded. Closed captioning is available. So if you'd like to use closed captioning, you can select that option on Zoom. And if you have any other access needs, please feel free to send me a message and we'll do what we can to meet those needs. Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Crane is our guest speaker today. He serves as the scholar in bioethics and Jewish thought at Emory University's Center for Ethics. He's a professor of medicine. Crane is the past president of the Society for Jewish Ethics, founder and co-editor of the Journal of Jewish Ethics, and author of Narratives in Jewish Bioethics, the Oxford Handbook of Jewish Ethics and Morality, Beastly Morality, Animals as Ethical Agents, Eating Ethically, Religion and Science for a Better Diet, and Judaism, Race, and Ethics, Conversations and Questions. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here, and we're excited to hear your Torah on this moment.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Shah, for inviting me, and hello to everybody else. This is really a pleasure and privilege to join this community that does such great work, both domestically and internationally. I really applaud all of your efforts and your concerns on these very complicated issues. What I have today is a preliminary discussion presentation on these issues about moral equivalency. And so I'm going to share my screen, but I do have the chat open. So should you have questions throughout this presentation, and I'm only going to talk for some time. If you have questions throughout, please do not hesitate to put it into the chat. Karen will also be watching the chat and will interrupt orally when there are common threads and themes. So with that, please allow me to share my screen. Somehow it is not sharing my screen. There it is. Just a minute. So I hope that you can see the hazards of moral equivalence. Is that correct? Can somebody say yes, please?
We have your slide deck. It's not in presentation mode yet.
I see. So that's what I need to figure out. Hold on a minute. Is that working now, or is it still in the slide deck?
Still the slide deck.
Technical difficulties, just a second.
Yep.
Great. All right. So what is moral equivalence? Sorry about that technical difficulty. So moral equivalence is a kind of language or rhetoric that you might encounter over the last couple of weeks, where it basically is asserting that entity A is more or less equal to entity B. And some of the language you might have come across during these last couple of weeks would be things that try and assert that entity A and B are of similar value, that the goodness or badness of one group is more or less the same as the other group, that perhaps their sufferings are of the same intensity, immensity, urgency, or that perhaps two entities are similarly responsible or culpable for the various atrocities and harms that have ensued. So concretely, what does that sound like? You might have heard somebody say something to this effect, that Hamas's actions on October 7th are justified by Israel's policies. So in other words, what the speaker is trying to articulate is that one group's actions are as morally valuable or as morally damnable as the other's actions. Somebody might have said along the way that you've come across that Palestinian babies are as precious as Israeli babies. In other words, they're saying that something that is pretty obvious. And the next question is, and so what would this mean? How should that be shaping our policies to protect our community, or how should it be influencing their actions? So these moral equivalences are often used to hide certain attitudes and opinions and worldviews, especially when they aren't so obvious as that statement. Another kind of statement that you might have heard is that somebody would say that there's practically no difference between collateral damage and terrorism. But what this does is that this is hiding a lot of the intention behind these kinds of activities. And we all know that when we evaluate the morality of a behavior or an action, that we need to look not only at what physically happened phenomenologically, but we also need to include intent as well. So why do people use this kind of moral equivalence language? They do so for a variety of reasons. Some people use it because they're confused and they want to hide their confusion about how to evaluate the stuff of this world. Other people use this kind of rhetoric to enable, as Dennis Prager has written, they use this rhetoric to enable the immoral to hide their immorality. So it can justify the unjustifiable. This is a kind of language that we hear on college campuses, we hear in communities, you might hear in your congregations, and we see it also sprinkled throughout the media, on the right, on the left, on those that are certainly pro-Palestinian, and even among Jewish communities as well. There's this language of moral equivalence that is being leveraged to persuade audiences to take a side. And that is understandable given the heightened tensions of this particular moment, but it can also do some damage to the parties that are embroiled in this conflict, as well as to the topic at hand, as well as to the audience. So I'm hoping that throughout this presentation and our conversations together, we can come up with some perhaps strategies to be a little bit more careful about how we use our language to talk about a very difficult topic, such as the current conflict that's going on between Israel and Hamas. So in my studies, I've also tried to find a couple of Judaic resources that might speak or lend a little bit of Judaic lens or flavor to this conversation. And these are not perfect sources, but they sort of, if you take your glasses off and squint at them, they do begin to lend a little bit of a Judaic language to this larger conversation about the use of language in a conflict or when describing a conflict. And so this resource from Avot the Rabbi Natan really does talk about how there are a variety of different created entities in the cosmos. And these entities are not coterminous. They are not co-equal with each other. They are distinct. They have different features. They have different agencies. They have different kinds of responsibilities. And frankly, they have different kinds of value in the world. And so when I am reading this source, and you can read it for a variety of different, in different ways, but when I'm reading in light of this conversation about moral equivalency, I take away from this that it's really important to make sure that I acknowledge the existence of moral distinctions, and that I need to recognize that those things do exist, that these moral distinctions exist not only in the entities of this world, but also in the events that have unfolded or will continue to unfold. And I should not be so eager to conflate things or events. And certainly I should not conflate people. This kind of moral equivalence is a subset of a larger kind of rhetorical move called false equivalency. And this is where you take something, an entity, a group, a community, which has a variety of different features. Let's call it feature W and feature X. And these are different sort of dimensions of this group. Now, it just so happens that another group shares that feature as well as its own peculiar features. So, for example, one common phrase that engages in this kind of false equivalency would go as follows. What they do is they collapse those two peculiar features and highlight the one that is shared. So, for example, they are both soft, cuddly things. That is why there is no difference between a cat and a dog. So it's collapsing the distinctiveness between these two entities in favor of highlighting that which is similar between them. Another common phrase might be, we all bleed red, and therefore there is no difference between us. What you might have heard in recent weeks here is that Israel's policies and practices are no different from South Africa's apartheid. This is probably an older trope than just what's been going on since October 7th, but it has certainly been leveraged in the media of late. You might have also heard somebody say that, well, Hamas is Amalek, or Hamas is like the Nazis. There might be some similarities, but there are also some significant differences. And some people might say something to the effect that October 7th in Israel is like September 11th in the United States. So again, there are some similarities, but there are also some significant differences. And the challenge with false equivalency is that it diminishes the peculiarity, especially when we're talking about historical events. It diminishes and dismisses those peculiarities. In the Judaic tradition, I found this text, and there are several that are like this, the Babylonian Talmud text, looking at a variety of different kinds of creatures. And here, this is in regards to the differences between, say, demons and ministering angels, as well as human beings. And what this text goes on to say is these entities share a great deal. And they also have unique features among them. And so, again, you can read a source like this in a variety of different ways. And there's cognate texts in a variety of other resources, classic Judaic sources as well. But for me, when I am looking at these texts, I am taking away from them something that, while similarities are amazing, those similarities do not justify ignoring meaningful differences and collapsing the categories altogether. There is a third rhetorical move that we also hear going on, especially in certain parts of certain communities, which is this notion of a false dilemma. And the logic goes like this, that either claim A or claim B is true. What does this mean? So a false dilemma would be saying something like, and here's a simplified mathematical example, that 1 + 1 is 4, or 1 + 1 = 12 is true. So either 1 + 1 = 4 or 1 + 1 = 12 is true. Well, therefore, it's not, since A is not the case, it must be that B is the case. And that is obviously not true. So whenever we have an either or statement like this, it forces the audience to assume that either A or B, these claims, are the only choices available to us. What does that look like in recent weeks, or what does it sound like? You've probably heard somebody say, you're either with me or my side, or you're against me or my side. So it's either or. Or you might have heard somebody say, this group is wholly righteous, or that group is wholly righteous. It's either we are in the right or they are in the right, and it can't be any other choice. Another version of that is not that they share the same quality, but the obverse quality. So you are either standing or speaking up on the side of good, or you are abetting the side of evil. So in other words, A is good and B is evil. And these are mutually exclusive categories, and you must identify with one or the other. You've probably heard iterations of this in a variety of different settings. And this is another form of a dangerous rhetoric. Where might we find this in Judaic resources? Well, perhaps you could read chapter 2 of the prophet Malachi. He ends chapter 2 with this verse here about how Malachi is admonishing the Israelites for saying that you have wearied God with your talk. And the community says, how have we wearied God? And Malachi says, because you have said either all who do evil are good in the sight of Adonai, and God delights in those evildoers, or some of you have said, where is God of justice? And Rashi amplifies this, this either or logic going on here. And what this whole chapter is trying to suggest is that there is really a grave importance to be very careful, that there are many in-between or alternative options between these two claims or statements, that these two mutually exclusive ones are not the only ones to consider. It is a false choice that a speaker is putting forward to their audience. And this is a rhetorical strategy that many people are using, especially in social media contexts, where they have just a few characters to fill out, and they present the issues as an either-or situation. And those either-ors are mutually exclusive and are often hide confusion. They hide also some hatred, and oftentimes they hide anti-Semitic sentiments. There are two other issues that this kind of language I have found to really dig to highlight. One is in regards to flaws, and the other one is in regards to instability. So some of the language, and you've probably read this or heard about this, is that people who engage in these kinds of rhetorical moves, they talk about the other person's flaws or the other group's flaws, and they really don't talk about our own flaws. And in fact, what they do is they exaggerate the flaws, the harms, the dangers, the ugliness of that other group. and they deny or dismiss or disavow that our group has ever done anything dangerous. We've heard this here in the American context, where frankly, we talk about how bad racism and slavery has been elsewhere, but we ourselves are not engaged in those kinds of activities. We might say that there was racism and slavery in the past, but we ourselves are not involved in those kinds of institutions and attitudes to this day. That is dangerous territory to go into, because if one scratches beneath the surface and engages in sincere self-assessment, one will find that in fact we too are flawed, and that we also need to be honest about owning up to those flaws, harms, and damages that we've done to ourselves and to our neighbors as well. When we turn to the question of instability, what has happened in recent decades in this with this rhetoric of moral equivalency is that certain language has become threatened. So ever since the 1980s, certainly ever since before the 1980s, but especially it began in earnest in the 1980s, there was a co-option of language. So a human rights language in particular. It was asserted in the 1980s, especially when we were very much concerned about the dynamics going on in Latin America, where there were sub-state actors, guerrilla fighters, trying to assert their grievances through violence and challenge the authority and stability of their local governments. And there was a rhetorical move to co-opt human rights language and basically make the argument that only states can commit war crimes, whereas sub-state actors cannot. And that is just untrue according to the instruments of international law. And of course, I stand to be corrected by the lawyers in this group who know more on this than I do. But there was a shaking of the semantic stability of certain language by when language such as moral equivalency is brought into play. Another kind of instability is brought to history itself, is that certain regimes will manipulate historiography and deploy a version of history that suits their political agendas. And this is particularly true of totalitarian ideologies, where they feel that they have the right to arrogate to themselves the privilege to describe historical events in a way that supports their political means and goals. And this is dangerous because it challenges the veracity of those historiographies, the versions of history. Certainly, we are very familiar with the victor's right history. People who are challenging those victors, sub-state actors in particular, try to offer a counter-narrative or a counter-tradition. And they have every right to do so, but in that very process, it challenges the stability of what we understand has gone on. And unfortunately, that very challenging can undermine the community, the international community, or even people individually within, say, a family, if they keep on hearing that history was not what they remember it to actually have been because of this counter narrative. They begin to, their sense of identity is thus thrown and destabilized. A third arena where this language begins to shake people is in the realms of values. And it was the case where, for example, the Soviet Union would cast aspersions on American values and say that, well, frankly, because the United States elections are not necessarily true and free and equal across the board with a capital E, therefore, the United States and its commitments to equality and freedom is a fraud. They have failed. And therefore, the value itself doesn't make much sense. Again, this is a totalitarian ideology that was using the language of their perceived opponent and using their language of values and using it to undermine the stability of that very community. So instability will begin to shake up the language, our notions of history and events, and our values, and can ultimately dismantle them altogether. So what might this mean for those of us who want to engage in conversation with folks? It means, the way that I read it, is that we need to be honest. We need to be honest about our histories, about the flaws that our communities have been involved in. There's really no shame in acknowledging our flawed history. It allows us to be sincere and not hide behind our own moral righteousness. And on the stability side, I encourage my students and my colleagues and my friends and my sons and even myself to be precise and consistent. So that when I am talking about a very complicated case like the situation that's unfolding in Israel and Gaza, I try to be as precise with my nouns and as consistent as possible, especially when describing the events. I try to use minimal adjectives that have not been overladen with academic jargon, but just describing the phenomena as basically as possible, and then use that terminology as consistently as possible, no matter who my audience might be, because I don't want to betray their trust by using some language that might show that I have certain allegiances that are not aligned with their own. So if we pull together these instructions from these resources, I think that there is something to be found in Jewish resources to help us navigate an emotionally fraught and difficult, historically complicated, politically volatile conflict that is outrageously tragic, that is painful. I wrote on Saturday night, October 7th, I wrote myself a little poem which said, "There will be no victors here, only losers of the most profound sort." And I fear that that is coming true. I think that what really matters for all of us is to be very careful in how we use our words when we are talking with our loved ones, when we are talking with our colleagues in our communities, with our students, with our neighbors across the street or across a body of water or a barrier. I think that we need to make sure that we are not overly simplifying things, that we're not conflating moral categories, that we're not making equations where those are unjustified, and that we are as honest and precise and consistent as possible. So these are just some of the resources that I have consulted over the last couple of weeks when thinking about these issues. I found Jean Kirkpatrick's essay on the myth of moral equivalence that she published in 1986 to be really powerful. Jim Loeffler just published yesterday a beautiful short piece on the memory trap. Felicia Herman is demonstrating, unfortunately, some of the dangers of this kind of logic of moral equivalency, moral and false equivalencies, and moral dilemma and false dilemmas. Sam Harris, Dennis Prager, and Tim Harding were some other resources that added some insights for me, and I'm happy to share these links with you later on. again, this is just a preliminary conversation to open up for us ways to think more carefully about the hazards of moral equivalence. And I welcome the opportunity to continue the conversation with you here and now.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions for you, and I'm happy to ask them. And as you are thinking through or something sparks something for you, feel free to send a message to Karen, our tech support person, or to me, and we will continue to ask Rabbi Jonathan these questions. We'll start off with the question about analogies, and I'm curious what role they play in false equivalencies. Should we use any analogies? Are they all bad? What's the role of analogies here?
Great question. So human beings, linguistically, epistemologically, we use analogies all the time. This is like that. This is not like that. We do it all the time, from the time that we are born until we are no longer animated. So it would be futile and inappropriate to say don't ever deploy analogies when talking about something as complex and as painful as a conflict between Israel and its neighbors. The challenge here, I think, linguistically, is to make sure that your analogies make sense, that they are not explosive, that they're not exploitative, that they that the linkages between the items, entity A and entity B, are internally logical. And also that you're not trying to manipulate your audience into thinking something that, frankly, is an unreasonable position to hold. We all want to be persuasive, and in order to be persuasive, we need to deploy language that makes sense to our audience. So again, when I talk with my students about ethically persuasive language, they need to be very conscientious about the worldview of their audience and speak in a language that makes sense to their audience. So for example, I would not be deploying a whole lot of statistics and numbers to persuade a 2-year-old to eat her spinach. I would use language that's more appropriate for the audience. So analogies, again, are a natural part of human language, and I would make sure that the analogies are appropriate for the context.
Thank you. Will you talk a little bit more about how history plays a role here, particularly as it relates to this moment in this conflict? But I'm curious beyond that, how you understand history in this conversation.
Well, it would be disingenuous to say that history has no role whatsoever. No event, as far as I know, erupts as if from a vacuum. So the question here is how far back does one go in order to start, quote unquote, a historical context? And then which perspectives are you going to champion in that historiography, in the narrative that you're going to provide of the historical events? And those are ethically fraught decisions. They are based on positionality and intersectionality, and perhaps the ideology or the political agenda that you, the speaker, are advocating or championing. So you just need to be, and it's in your prerogative to say the history that I'm going to give to this particular context is going to start in 1967. That's your prerogative to start in 1967 instead of the 17th century. But you need to justify why you're starting in 1967, and you also need to justify why you're privileging a particular perspective or interpretation of the historical record. Without doing those clarifications of why you are choosing a particular vantage point, does a disservice to yourself, to your audience, as well as to the subject matter. So again, it's really important for any speaker, especially in the public arena or in the semi-public arena in a congregation, to make clear what one's vantage point is and why you think that vantage point should be given a privileged status in this particular moment.
Thank you. Would you be able to provide us some examples of these types of conversations and what it would look like to have this conversation using the language that you're demonstrating for us?
Sorry, somebody's ringing my doorbell quite vociferously. Could you just repeat that, Rabbi
Yeah,
Jonathan?
I'd love to hear I'd love to hear some examples of what this looks like in practice, some examples of conversations that have been helpful, some language and conversations that have not been good or helpful.
So conversations that have not been helpful are probably those that occur, especially on social media contexts, because of the limited and constrained constraints that those platforms provide. It's really hard to provide nuance in 120 characters. It's really hard to provide historical context and multiple perspectives, much less disclosing why one is holding a particular vantage point as well. So again, so constructive conversations I have found to be most meaningful when they are face-to-face, when the people who are participating are in as much physical comfort as possible so that they can pay attention to the content of the conversation and be relatively emotionally dispassionate about it. It doesn't mean that they're indifferent to the topic at hand, but it allows for them to participate in a way that enables them to pay attention to the content rather than their own personal grievances in that particular moment. So I encourage those of you who are community leaders to think very carefully about when and where and how you are going to facilitate these conversations. Be very thoughtful to make sure that the context is one in which people feel welcome and not threatened. I remember a particular incident at one of my schools where during a BDS week, there was a conversation and there were in a huge auditorium and there were monitors standing in the aisles of the auditorium, not looking at the stage, but looking at all of the audience members and making sure that none of the audience members were engaging in kind of anything that might have been disruptive behavior. And it was quite threatening. And that put a chill effect on the whole, the quality of that conversation. So I encourage you not to do that. I encourage you to create an environment where people feel welcomed and safe to articulate their questions, their concerns, and more importantly, their feelings. I think that it's especially during these initial weeks, people are feeling a lot and feeling intensely, and we need to give space and honor to that emotional dynamic that's all of us are experiencing.
Emotional piece as well. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the ways in which people are using these false equivalencies and how you engage with people who are presenting misinformation or accusing other people of engaging with propaganda and using this this type of narrative and strategy as a way to promote something that isn't helpful and perhaps conflate with goals.
Right. So in those instances, if I have access to the speaker, and oftentimes I don't have access to the speaker, but if I do have access to a speaker who is engaging in moral equivalency or false equivalencies or false dilemmas, or spouting, frankly, anti-Semitic epithets or anti-Zionist epithets, I have a variety of questions for them. One is, do they truly understand what they are saying? And scratch beneath the surface a little bit. And two, I would want to ask them, do they feel better? Do you feel better now that you have spouted this hateful rhetoric in my face? Do you really feel that you are better than I am or better than the Israeli community that's making difficult decisions? And really try and figure out how their speech that is damaging, how it actually benefits them. And I have yet to find anybody who's willing to say that it actually is beneficial for themselves. They're doing so because oftentimes because they've seen other people do it. I've seen students echo or parrot what has been said elsewhere, but they don't really truly understand the complexity of the issues. They don't truly understand how it might be hurtful to certain audiences, including myself. And so I've just by asking them those basic questions, I try very hard not to take things personally because it's not about me. I try and take it not personally, so I remain calm and I just ask them, do you feel better? Do you really understand what you're trying to say here? Do you understand the harms that those words are causing to various audiences? And invite them to learn from their own language.
Thank you. Yeah, such a powerful framework of inviting someone to learn from themselves and from their language. I want to shift us back to history a little bit, which is how do you engage and answer the question of who was in the land first? I think often people start with biblical times and we hear others who start later. And how do we engage with, it seems like there's multiple history narratives happening at the same time. How do we hold all of those narratives?
It's such a fascinating conversation. And I would ask those people who are very adamant about exploring it, why? What does it matter? What does it matter today? Who was in which land first? Because we can't go back in time. We cannot go back into history. We can go back and change historiography, our writing of these events, but we can't change what actually happened 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. We can't change that. The only thing that we can change is our mind and our behavior. Hopefully we can change our attitudes as well. And so for me, the questions that I would want to engage in with those people who are so adamant about digging into the archaeological record to figure out who was here first is, to what end? For what reason is this line of investigation so darn important that it is precluding your ability to invest in the well-being of your neighbor? That coexistence is diminished because you're so impassioned about my existence. Why is that so important? So I would want to figure out why people are so adamant about figuring out who was here first. There's always going to be somebody who preceded that.
Thank you. There's some questions about criticizing Israel and critique of Israel and what happens when the need to critique is justified and holding a legitimate need to critique here.
Absolutely. So Israel is a nation state. It is a nation state just like the United States is a nation state, just like Guatemala or France. And so the question for me is not the critique of any country and its policies. The question for me is why one particular country warrants extraordinary critique. Why does one particular country warrant a double standard? That if one is going to critique Israel for its handling of minority populations, great. I think that that's a legitimate line of criticism against that nation state, but it should be no more and no less vociferous than a line of investigation against other nation states that also engage in disproportionate treatment of minority populations. So it's the exceptionalism. Why does Israel warrant exceptional criticism? Not the fact that Israel is a country, its communities have voted for certain kinds of governments, and those governmental leaders have pursued particular policies. I think all of that is open for analysis and criticism. But perhaps it should also be remembered that it is no better and no worse than any other country and should not be scrutinized to any lesser or more degree than any other country.
Thanks. I think there's a number of questions about what does it mean to, I know we're supposed to avoid false equivalencies, but how do we do this when we're seeing so much death and so much destruction and death of babies everywhere? And how do we hold this in the face of terrible destruction?
Thank you for that question. I think that's a really important one, is that numbers are going to be piling up. And they are tragic. It's not just the numbers, it's the individuals and their progeny that are going to be lost forever. And it's sad. It's very sad. And that's just at the phenomenological level. But I think, again, getting back to our very first piece of conversation about moral dimensions is the question of intention. What is the intention behind those deaths? And I think that it's really important for us to remember that and this is my understanding of Israeli military history and the ways that Israel has gone about, for the most part, deciding how to defend itself, is that it has intentionally tried to minimize collateral damage. It is not perfect. No execution of warfare is perfect. There will always be collateral damage. There will always be a body count of innocents, civilians. But the intention behind at least the Israeli activities, as far as I can tell, is to keep those to a minimum. And I cannot say that that same intention is found by the Hamas fighters. And so there is a moral inequivalence there about the number, the intention behind the numbers of dead on both sides of the wall down in Gaza and throughout Israel.
There's so many questions and there's so much that is being asked and shared, and I want to move us along with one final question, which is, I'm curious, we're a rabbinic organization, and we're an organization committed to using Jewish text and Jewish tradition to shape how we make moral decisions. And I'm curious for you how Jewish tradition is helping you understand morality in this moment.
Ooh, that's a really good question. Judaism has provided me an infinite resource of tools to think very carefully about the complexity of this world. I take refuge in our narrative traditions that show that the world is populated by fallible people who make mistakes, who try their best given their circumstances, and they strive toward righteousness, even though they might fail. And we see this from the biblical time through the rabbinic period and even into the modern period. And I take refuge in that trope, that despite our limitations, strive we must for making the world a better, safer, more humane place. I also take refuge in our rituals. I think Judaism has done a wonderful job about providing us ways to commune and to be with each other, to be present with each other. Minyans require people being present. Most of our holiday celebrations require interacting. And we can't be Jewish in a vacuum, individually, atomized. We need to be communal creatures. And I think that that's really important. It's countercultural right now, given how much our technologies of convenience have allowed us to become disaggregated, to be in our own homes and be behind and hide behind our screens. Judaism requires us to be panim al panim, to be face to face. When it comes to ethical decision making, it provides me a host of values to take very seriously when I'm faced with a true moral dilemma. It also teaches me to pay attention to when something that appears to be a dilemma is actually not. And to make sure that it's not an issue of convenience or an issue of logistics, and really discern and differentiate between the two. So again, I think Judaism is an incredible, rich resource. It's not perfect, but it has provided me and my family and my community innumerable ways to navigate these very difficult times. It's amazing to see the various ways that people here on this call and throughout these communities inspire their own communities to heal, to mend, and to forge ahead despite the uncertainties that lay ahead.
Thank you. What a powerful way to wrap this up. And I'm thinking about all of the different questions and debates and discussions happening throughout the chat, sparked by the words of Torah that you brought today. And I'm thinking about Jewish tradition's value of machlochet l'shem shamayim, discussion and disagreement for the sake of heaven, and the way in which the power and the Torah that you're bringing and that we seem to be modeling in this space and beyond feels so clearly an embodiment of that idea of being able to hold difference, being able to hold debate, and being able to grapple and question with each other, seeing the holiness and divinity within each of us. So thank you so much, Rabbi Crane, for being here and for sharing this. And to everyone for bringing yourselves, your questions, your honesty, your critiques, and your grappling. And as I said at the beginning, as this war goes on, we're grappling with moral questions and lots to be exploring. And our role here at Trua is we're going to be providing you with language and texts and opportunities to continue to learn together. So we're going to be providing texts on our social medias, as we already are, and we'll be having webinars to learn from various Torah scholars in the coming weeks, who will be sharing their unique perspectives on morality and what it means to be thinking really intentionally about Jewish tradition as we shape and understand how to engage with the questions of this war. So thank you again, Rabbi Crane, and thank you to our Trua staff who have worked tirelessly to make this event happen and possible. Rabbi Matt Dreffen, Karen Flagler, Victoria Cano, Shira Danan, Rabbi Becky J, Rabbi Meyerowitz Nelson, and Maddie Spector. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We'd love to hear your feedback on this program as we're continuing to think about our response to this war, as we're thinking about what types of programs and Torah you all would like to learn. Please fill out the survey. It'll take you about 60 seconds, and it really means a lot to us. So thank you all for coming. My blessing for all of us is that we can dwell in the humility and honor, that we can hold the difference, and we can come together and see the true B'Tselem Elohim in each and every person, both in front of our faces in America and around the world. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.